Hello and welcome back to my deep dive into the Name of the Wind. Today I'm going to be going through chapter 2. Now, while I'm going chapter by chapter through the book, I am giving spoiler warnings for the entire Name of the Wind and the Wise Man's Fear, because while I'm going chapter by chapter, I will be talking about it in context of the first two books in the series. So, with that, chapter 2 is interesting to me first because of how it is situated between chapters 1 and 3. Chapters 1 and 3 both take place entirely in the Waystone Inn. And then chapter 2, we are outside, away from the Waystone Inn. Chapters 1 and 3 are both pretty long, kind of dense chapters where a lot happens. And chapter 2 is just like one really interesting scene outside. And it's kind of a break, I feel like, from our time in the Waystone Inn with so much world building. Not that there is not a lot of world building in this chapter. We're about to talk about a lot of the world building because the story and world building are what I enjoy most about these books. So I talk about it a lot. But with that, it is this nice little break from the setting of the Waystone Inn and the world building there. It's also a bit of comic relief, which is kind of fun thinking about it in the theatrical sense again. So in my mind, chapter 1 is this, Broadway theater scene with the Waystone Inn as the set. We go downstairs, we go upstairs, we go to sleep, we go downstairs, and then the scene ends. And then the next day, this next scene isn't at the Waystone Inn. So instead, we have a little, maybe curtain come up. I have no theater arts knowledge, so I don't know how we would do this. If you know, tell me. But in my mind, a new little scene would be off to the side, and it is just this outdoor, simple scene. And I'm going to use the author's words here to open us into chapter 2, titled A Beautiful Day, and kind of get into why I think this chapter serves as a bit of levity after the very dark tone that was set and particularly ended on in chapter 1. So here we are, opening chapter 2 after that dark, somber ending to chapter 1. It was one of those perfect autumn days, so common in stories, and so rare in the real world. The weather was warm and dry, ideal for ripening a field of wheat or corn. On both sides of the road, the trees were changing color. Tall poplars had gone a buttery yellow, while the shrubby sumac encroaching on the road was tinged a violent red. Only the old oaks seemed reluctant to give up the summer, and their leaves remained an even mingling of gold and green. Everything said, you couldn't hope for a nicer day to have half a dozen ex-soldiers with hunting bows relieve you of everything you owned. Now, I say this is comedy because it's kind of like a little bit of Anthony Jeselnik light, where you set this scene up and you think it's going to be, this absolute beautiful description. So what happens on a beautifully described day? Something great, right? You go on a picnic, or you read a book, outside, or you go for a walk and you see a deer. Like, it's a beautiful day. You expect a beautiful thing is going to happen. But instead we have a beautiful day, and the turn for the joke comes, and on this beautiful day we see somebody is being robbed, or even more eloquently, is being relieved of everything you owned. And so I think there's a good little, theatrical like joke there in the writing of setting up the beauty and then hitting you with the ugly underbelly of what's really happening. Now we have the dialogue start with the Chronicler. "She's not much of a horse, sir," Chronicler said. "One small step above a dray, and when it rains she—" The man cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Listen, friend, the king's army is paying good money for anything with 4 legs and at least 1 eye. If you were stark mad and riding a hobby horse down the road, I'd still take it off you. And so the dialogue really brings us into the scene. We hear that it's ex-soldiers that are robbing this person. And so now we get this kind of, a little bit of last pleading from the person being robbed if they can keep their horse. Pretty important. And a very clear and not concise no. Actually, quite an eloquent no from this ex-soldier. So this is someone who is educated. They can speak clearly. And we get more description about him. Their leader had an air of command about him. Chronicler guessed he had been a low-ranking officer not long ago. Just hop down, he said seriously. We'll get this done with and you can be on your way. And so now we get the tone of this robbery not being the tone of violence wasn't really there from the beginning. It was a more formal tone to it. And so that makes sense if we are talking about ex-soldiers. These are people who maybe are fairly disciplined. And so even though they're doing this act, that is not one that a soldier should be doing, depending on when you're looking at war. And I'm watching a little bit of Norseman again. The show's pretty funny. And so I think about how they approached robbery and thieving a little differently than this one. And so that is important. We have this formality to it. So we know that these were more formal soldiers. They seemed like they lived and are still living by a code. But if they're not soldiers anymore, what made them leave that war? Because if these are men who still hold to a type of code and honor in this robbery, they are still behaving in a very civil way. We're going to get into it more. Then why aren't they still soldiers? And so that kind of gives you this feeling of things are off, like things are not correct in this world. The robbery going with these rules that you wouldn't typically think of in a robbery is jarring, and I think that's a little bit of the joke as well. So let's read a touch of this. Chronicler climbed down from his horse. He had been robbed before, and knew when there was nothing to be gained of discussion. These fellows knew their business. No energy was wasted on bravado or idle threats. One of them looked over the horse, checking hooves, teeth, and harness. 2 others went through his saddlebags with military efficiency, laying all his worldly possessions out on the ground. 2 blankets, a hooded cloak, the flat leather satchel, and his heavy, well-stocked travel sack. That's all of it, Commander, one of the men said, except for about 20 pounds of oats. The commander knelt down and opened the flat leather satchel, peering inside. There's nothing but paper and pens in there, Chronicler said. The commander turned to look backward over his shoulder. You a scribe, then? Chronicler nodded. It's my livelihood, sir, and no real use to you. The man looked through the satchel, found it to be true, and set it aside. Then he upended the travel sack onto Chronicler's spread cloak and poked idly through the contents. Now, this next scene, we have the soldiers coming in and taking his items, but also there's rules to it. The commander's if you take something and you have a similar thing that's not as good, you leave that. So if you're taking his cloak, you leave him your not as good cloak. If you're taking his salt, if you can leave something else, or idea is that they're doing this respectfully. Now, as far as detailed reread deep dives go, I'm sure there are some really interesting theories in here about what they took and kind of some of the symbolism it might have. I haven't gone down that road yet and looked at it that way. And I don't think I will right now unless someone else maybe has a theory they want to link in the comments. I would love to read that and hear someone else's take. But the exchange of goods that happens here happens in a very civil, polite way, back and forth. Because the soldiers are being polite, Chronicler is then polite back, and they have kind of this, while this terrible thing is happening, it's happening in the best way it could, because no one's getting beaten bloody. It's just kind of matter of fact. This is part of being on the road. And we do get the sense that Chronicler's been robbed before, so this isn't completely foreign to him. that is reinforced in the next page that we turn to. But this back and forth, I think, also does a good job for me of opening up a little bit of the kind of the different rules that are going on right now. So kind of like in Alice in Wonderland, if we're coming of age, you're a kid and you're trying to figure out the adult world and it's very confusing and people are always shouting and you don't get the rules and the rules are changing. That feeling of things are amiss and I'm trying to figure out the rules. You get that? I get that as a reader here. Like, things are amiss. This isn't how robberies are supposed to go. Like, why is it going this way? What is going on in this world where I don't know the rules that are being followed? Are these men following their morals and ethics? Is that why they left the war? Or there's just questions about what rules are being followed and that the rules are a little bit off from expectation right now. And so I think this chapter kind of opens that theme up a little bit, and it's something I love to look more into as I reread the book, kind of thinking about the different forms of law and what laws people are obeying and what laws people aren't obeying, and kind of trying to figure out why. Massive questions, I know, but that's what a reread is for, to get to pay attention to some of these bigger questions. And so one of the interesting endings here is that the commander notices jewelry on the Chronicler and he says, "What's that around your neck?" Chronicler unbuttoned his shirt, revealing a dull ring of metal hanging from a leather cord. "Just iron, sir." The commander came close and rubbed it between his fingers before letting it fall back against Chronicler's chest. "Keep it then. I'm not one to come between a man and his religion." And so here it's interesting because I gave the spoiler warning already. We know that the Chronicler knows the name of iron, that he has studied at the university and he knows the name of iron. He can command it. He does when he's in the Waystone Inn later. And so this ring of iron around his neck kind of makes me think of the ring of stone that Fella made when she mastered the name of stone. And so rings of different types come up a lot in these novels. And it's just nice to notice that he has a ring of iron and he knows the name of iron. And I wonder if, that is a little bit relevant at some point, what that really means. After that, we have the Chronicler describe to us that he was kind of prepared to be robbed. He's been robbed before. He seems to travel quite a bit on the road. And while he might not be very lucky, you might call him luckless. You might not, depending on how you picture that scene. You might call him lackless. You might not, depending on how you look at Quoth's and the Chronicler's lineage. So with that, we get that the Chronicler was somewhat prepared for this to happen. And he explains to us, or the kind of omniscient voice that we have going on explains to us how the Chronicler was prepared. So, when Chronicler could no longer hear their hoofbeats in the distance, he repacked his travel sack, making sure everything was well stowed. Then he tugged off one of his boots, stripped out the lining, and removed a tightly wrapped bundle of coins, stuffed deep into the toe. He moved some of these into his purse, then unfastened his pants, produced another bundle of coins from underneath several layers of clothes, and moved some of that money into his purse as well. The key was to keep the proper amount in your purse. Too little, and they would be disappointed and prone to look for more. Too much, and they would be excited and might get greedy. There was a third bundle of coins baked into the stale loaf of bread that only the most desperate of criminals would be interested in. He left that alone for now, as well as the whole silver talent he had hidden in a jar of ink. Over the years, he had come to think of that last as more of a luck piece. No one had ever found that. And so, this one, just so well written, it has such a nice cadence to it as you read it, but also it kind of builds up that the Chronicler was prepared for something like this. And he even says at the very end of it, as he shoulders his As he shouldered his travel sack and satchel, Chronicler found himself feeling remarkably lighthearted. The worst had happened, and it hadn't been that bad. Now that reminds me of Kilvin with the fire in the fishery, when he gives us the expression that disaster happens like every 7 years and that they'd been overdue for a disaster. That's when we kind of learn that the word coat means disaster. More spoilers there. But he talks about how the worst, a bad disaster had happened and it hadn't been that bad. So we have that little parallel with the Chronicler and Kilvin here, which I find is interesting. I don't know if the Chronicler had studied under Kilvin or not when he worked at the fishery, or when he went to school at the university, if he worked in the fishery. I'm not sure. But the chapter closes out. A breeze tussled through the trees, sending poplar leaves spinning like golden coins down onto the rutted dirt road. It was a beautiful day. So again, that literary repetition in the very beginning and the very end of this chapter with the, title of the chapter being A Beautiful Day. It ends with It was a beautiful day. And I just want to mention that this description in the very beginning of the chapter of the kind of foliage, I love how how the author describes these oak trees. Only the old oaks seemed reluctant to give up the summer, and their leaves remained an even mingling of gold and green. And just assigning that little, human quality, a little anthropomorphizing of the tree to be reluctant to give up summer. And I can definitely remember as a kid, especially that feeling of being like reluctant to give up summer. And so it really brings like another level of liveliness, I feel, to the setting that we're in, to the foliage and the nature. Even that the sumac was tinged a violent red, like that's a very kind of movement, lively based description of the color. And so the writing is again why I end up reading the books multiple times, is it's very pleasant to read. I find the language to be accessible, but still like just challenging enough to keep you engaged, to keep me engaged. That's how I feel. And so I enjoy the language in this chapter that's breaking up the two other longer chapters that we have in the other setting of the Waystone Inn. So really making this little setting come alive, takes me out of the inn, puts me in this nature area for a moment, and then after this chapter ends, a breeze tussled through the trees, sending poplar leaves spinning like golden coins down onto the rutted dirt road. It was a beautiful day. And so we have that kind of more positive tone ending, and then we turn the page and here we are at chapter 3, Wood and Word. And when I do the chapter 3 video next, we are going to be back inside the Waystone Inn with Coat, and we get introduced to Coat's folly, the sword that he is going to hang up in the beginning of that chapter of Wood and Word. Now, on a personal note, I mentioned at the end of my chapter 1 video that I was reading The Once and Future King, and how there had been that interesting point where the audiobook and the text-based book I was reading diverged, and there was a scene in the audiobook that wasn't in the text-based book. So this is chapter 6 of the first of these in the Sword and the Stone. And I told that story because I was all excited to talk about like kind of that fun, interesting feeling of missing that part of the book. But I had actually brought it up because the reason I wanted to read the scene where Merlin comes to rescue the Wart and Kay from the witch's cottage in the woods, the witch Min, I'm pretty sure, is because that scene has some really interesting parallels to the introduction of Abinthy that's going to come up later on. And so I wanted to read it because there was this description of the cottage that it's like a wooden sign they have outside the cottage to like talk about what they do there. And it seems like it kind of parallels the cadence of Abinthy's sign. And then we have the witch has blue fire come out of her fingertips. And so it's kind of fun seeing the blue fire there. And then also one of the bigger twists is that the wart is locked in a cage. That's King Arthur's like child name. And so he's locked in the cage in the witch's cottage. And the goat next to him is like, listen, you just have to whisper these words into the lock to get us out, but I can't whisper because I'm a goat. So like, if you can do it, you can get us out. And so it's really cool that it's true. These locks are controlled or opened by spoken word. And so it was fun to have spoken word locks right there in the Once and Future King. And then of course that being kind of an idea that at least comes up in the Name of the Wind is, can you open locks just by speaking to them? Because there's so much language in being, knowing the true names of things, even kind of interpreting the Yiddish not writing along the locks could be an interesting. So it ties in with this greater, exciting kind of fantasy influence of what can open and what can control locks, and why are things locked away, and do we want to open them or not, and all the fun questions. So I just wanted to add that was actually why I wanted to read that part of the book again. Excuse me. And since I just told that story at the end of the last chapter, I thought I'd update you in this one and let you know that I am going to be giving more updates over on my Patreon as a very new, small YouTube channel taking on this project that I hope a lot of people will enjoy and like. I'd love to connect with you people who do enjoy and like it and are able to do any kind of support over on Patreon. So I'm going to open that up and add a link to that below. And that is a place where I plan to give like a weekly update on, books that I'm reading outside of the Name of the Wind, or sometimes a YouTube video that I've been watching and enjoyed because I really enjoy some YouTube videos, or just a little note kind of giving an update on a video, super informal, just a weekly extra small update from me to someone else who is interested in this channel and what I'm spending such a good amount of time chatting with you about. So link to the Patreon will be below, and the video for chapter 3 will be up next. That is another longer chapter. We are going to be back in the Waystone Inn, and not only do we get introduced to the sword in chapter 3, we get a little more info from Bast, but we also have visitors come through the inn, and one of the visitors in particular, the one that recognizes Coat as Kavoth, that happens in chapter 3, and that is going to be a scene I really want to dig into, because what he says to him it generates more questions that we don't have answers to. And so I'm super excited to look at that more carefully and break it down and read it out to you. So make sure you're subscribed and come on back for my chapter 3 deep dive. I will see you there.